Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into something that you've clearly shown a lot of interest in.
Yeah.
The push to end minimum wage for disabled workers.
Mm-hmm.
And you sent me over a ton of really fascinating stuff.
Oh, good.
Articles, research, and even like a whole deep dive into Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the actual policy that makes a minimum wage possible.
Right. So it seems like you're really interested in understanding, both sides of the argument,
right,
and what some states are already doing to try to change things.
Yeah. And I have to say, like, full disclosure, when I saw that one of the sources you sent me mentioned a woman who worked at a sheltered workshop for 20 years.
Right.
And never made more than $2 an hour.
Yeah.
Like, that really hit me hard.
Yeah.
This isn't just about numbers on a page.
Yeah.
This is about people's lives.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to kind of understand, how we even got here.
Right.
Section 14C was introduced way back in 1938 as part of the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Okay.
And the initial idea was to encourage businesses to hire disabled workers.
Okay.
Even if they couldn't pay them a full minimum wage.
So on the surface, it sounds like, good intentions.
Right.
But I'm guessing things haven't really worked out the way people hoped.
Yeah, not exactly. The intention might have been good.
Right.
But the way it's actually impacted people has been, let's just say problematic.
Okay.
You highlighted a study that found the average wage for someone working under a 14C certificate is only $4.15 an hour.
Wow.
More than half of those people earn less than $3.50 an hour, and some are paid less than 25 cents an hour.
I'm speechless.
Yeah.
Like, we all know that minimum wage isn't exactly a living wage these days.
Right.
But this is like a whole other level of exploitation.
Yeah. It's really disturbing when you think about it. And it gets even more complicated because over 90% of these certificates are held by community rehabilitation programs, or CRPs.
Okay.
So many of them provide work for part of the day.
Okay.
And then focus on things like personal care and daily living skills.
So instead of being like a bridge to competitive employment,
right,
it sounds like 14C has kind of trapped a lot of people with disabilities in the system that keeps them segregated and underpaid.
Yeah, one of your sources was the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights.
Okay.
And they actually called it out and said that it creates a system where people with disabilities are segregated paid subminimum wages and denied opportunities to gain experience.
It's just heartbreaking that a policy that was designed to help has actually done the opposite.
Yeah.
Further impoverished and isolated the very people it's supposed to support.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads us into this whole movement to eliminate subminimum wage entirely.
Okay.
And one of the interesting things is how many states are leading the charge on this.
Yeah.
10 states have already completely eliminated it.
Wow.
And 5 more are in the process of phasing it out.
That's a pretty clear sign that something's not working.
Yeah.
What do you think is driving this change?
Well, a few things you flagged in your research.
Uh-huh.
First, I think attitudes towards disability have really shifted a lot since 1938.
Yeah.
Especially after the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right.
I think we're seeing a whole generation of people who, view themselves as capable of competitive employment.
The ADA was a huge turning point, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of recognizing the rights and the potential of people with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this growing sense that 14C, instead of helping people achieve financial independence, might actually be preventing it.
Yeah.
One of the sources called it a perverse incentive that keeps people trapped in poverty.
Yeah, it's like if you're only paying someone pennies, they're never going to be able to break free from that cycle.
Right, and that actually goes directly against one of the core goals of the ADA, which is promoting economic self-sufficiency for people with disabilities.
It sounds like a real conflict.
Yeah.
Between the original intention of 14C and the reality of how it's playing out.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any arguments at all for keeping this system?
Oh, yeah.
Because you sent me some sources with different perspectives on that, too.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand the nuances of this whole debate. For example, you pointed out an article where some families of older adults with disabilities expressed concerns about completely ending the program.
Yeah.
They were worried that it could disrupt the routine in the community that their loved ones rely on.
I was really struck by that article.
Yeah.
It makes sense that people would be hesitant to embrace change.
Right.
Especially when it involves, the well-being of a loved one.
Yeah, and for some families, it's not even about the wage itself. It's about the stability and the support that these programs have provided for years.
I can see that.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated issue.
It is.
With like real human stories on all sides. But you were talking about older adults specifically.
Yeah.
Do younger people with disabilities have a different view?
That's a great question. And yeah, many younger people with disabilities, especially those who grew up with the ADA, view 14C very differently. They see it as fundamentally unfair and limiting. They want a real chance at competitive, integrated employment. Not just, a paycheck that barely covers their basic needs.
It's not just about the money. It's about dignity too, right?
Exactly.
It's the chance to build a meaningful life.
Absolutely.
Contribute to society. Be treated with respect.
It's about recognizing that people with disabilities have the same rights to pursue their dreams and aspirations as anyone else.
I'm getting fired up just thinking about this conversation.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Okay, so we've got this clash of values. We've got states taking action. We've got these really passionate arguments on both sides.
Yeah.
What's happening at the federal level to address all of this?
Well, a lot, actually. And your research really dives into some specific initiatives that I think you'll find fascinating.
Okay.
So
let's hear it.
So welcome back to our deep dive into the push to end subminimum wage for disabled workers.
I'm glad we're continuing this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
In part one, we talked about, the history of Section 14C.
Right.
The arguments for and against it.
Yeah.
And how some states are already making changes. But you mentioned that there are some really fascinating things happening at the federal level, too.
Yeah.
What's going on up there?
Well, one of the biggest things is this thing called the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act.
Okay.
Or TCIEA.
Okay.
Which you highlighted in your research.
Yeah.
And it was actually reintroduced in 2023 with the aim of phasing out 14C entirely.
Whoa, okay. That sounds like a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for me? Like, what exactly would the TCIEA do?
Sure. So basically, it would prohibit new 14C certificates and then phase out the existing ones over a 5-year period.
Okay.
And it also proposes these grants to help businesses transition to paying competitive wages to disabled employees.
So this would be like a total overhaul of the system.
Pretty much, yeah.
What kind of response has it gotten?
It's definitely generated a lot of discussion and debate.
Yeah.
Which, is reflected in the sources you sent.
Right.
But for the most part, disability rights groups are in favor of it.
Yeah.
They see it as, a long overdue step toward equity and inclusion.
Yeah, I imagine there's some pushback too, though, right?
Yeah, there is. Some of the organizations that operate sheltered workshops and employ people, under these 14C certificates have raised concerns about, how it might impact their operations and the workers they serve.
Yeah, it's that tension we talked about earlier.
Right, like that desire for change.
Yeah.
Versus the fear of disrupting a system that for some people has, provided a sense of stability and community.
Yeah, exactly.
And it really highlights, the need for a thoughtful and well-planned transition. We can't just abolish 14C without making sure that there are, systems in place to support everyone.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's the TCIEA. What about other federal initiatives?
Yeah.
I know you mentioned something about the U.S. Ability One Commission making a big change.
Oh, yeah, you're right. The Ability One Commission.
Yeah.
Which provides employment for people with disabilities through government contracts.
Okay.
They actually ended subminimum wage for all of their contracts back in 2022.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it was a major victory for, advocates of competitive integrated employment.
That's a really concrete example of how change can actually happen.
Absolutely.
And it sets a pretty powerful precedent for other employers.
It does.
Showing that it is possible to transition away from this without sacrificing quality or productivity.
Yeah. I think it's a real testament to the power of advocacy and this growing recognition that people with disabilities deserve equal opportunities and fair compensation.
Okay, I'm feeling really energized by these positive developments.
Yeah.
What about the Disability Innovation Fund?
Oh, yeah.
I remember that from the research as well.
Yeah, that one's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's focused on funding these creative approaches to help people transition to competitive employment.
So it's about finding solutions that actually work for individuals.
Yeah.
Rather than just sticking with like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. And it acknowledges that we don't have all the answers yet.
Right.
We need to be willing to experiment,
right.
learn from, what works and what doesn't, and really kind of adapt to the evolving needs of the workforce.
I love that. Embracing innovation and not being afraid to try new things.
Right.
But even with all this positive movement at the federal level, I think it's important to zoom out a little bit and remember, like, the human side of this.
Absolutely.
One of your sources talked about the deep impact that societal attitudes and perceptions have on people with disabilities.
That is such an important point.
Yeah.
For decades, society has really viewed disability through this lens of deficit.
Right.
Like focusing on what people can't do rather than what they can do.
Yeah.
And that mindset has really permeated, everything from education to employment.
Right.
And it's created these barriers and limited opportunities.
It's like we've created this self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is.
Where people with disabilities are expected to be dependent and incapable.
Mm-hmm.
So they're never given the chance to prove otherwise.
And that ties in directly to this whole subminimum wage debate.
Right.
When we undervalue someone's work, we're basically saying that they're worth less than other workers.
Yeah.
And it's dehumanizing.
It is.
And it perpetuates this cycle of poverty and marginalization.
Right. It's sending this message that they're not deserving of the same respect and dignity and economic opportunities as everyone else.
One of your sources put it really well.
Yeah.
They said, ending subminimum wage isn't just about economics, it's about social justice.
Yeah, that really resonated with me too.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that inherent value and potential of all individuals, regardless of their abilities or disabilities.
It's about creating a society where everyone has the chance to contribute and thrive and be valued for who they are.
That's a beautiful vision.
It is.
I'm also thinking about, like, the practical side of this.
Yeah.
Let's say we actually do manage to phase out 14C.
Right.
And eliminate subminimum wage.
Yeah.
What needs to happen to make sure that the transition is smooth?
Yeah.
And that no one falls through the cracks?
You're asking all the right questions.
Okay.
You can't just dismantle a system
right.
without having something better in place.
Right.
And that's where this holistic approach comes in.
Okay. What would that look like?
Well, you highlighted a few key areas in your research that I think are, particularly important.
Okay.
And the first one is that we need to expand access to these high-quality, individualized support services.
So it's about, like, providing the tools and resources that people need to actually succeed.
Absolutely.
Not just expect them to figure it out on their own.
Right. And it's important to really personalize those supports.
Okay.
What works for one person might not work for another. So we need to move away from this kind of like one-size-fits-all model and really embrace flexibility and individualization.
What else?
Another big piece is addressing the systemic barriers that often prevent people with disabilities from getting jobs and keeping jobs.
Okay.
We need to improve accessibility, in workplaces, in transportation systems, in community spaces.
So it's not just about changing attitudes. It's about changing the actual physical environment.
Yeah, to make it truly inclusive.
Yeah.
And, we can't ignore the role of employers in all of this. They need to be educated about the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. They need to be given the resources to make reasonable accommodations. And we need to hold them accountable for creating inclusive and equitable workplaces.
So it's a multifaceted effort.
It is.
It involves government, businesses, nonprofits, individuals. Everyone has a role to play.
Everyone.
Okay.
In building this more inclusive future.
And I think one of the most important things we can do is to shift the narrative.
Absolutely.
We need to stop focusing on what people with disabilities can't do and start highlighting their strengths and their skills and their contributions.
We need to celebrate their talents.
Yeah.
Recognize their potential and see them as valuable members of the workforce and society.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about turning those perceptions on their head.
It is.
And showing the world what's truly possible.
And it's about remembering that this isn't just about helping people with disabilities. It's about recognizing their inherent rights.
Yes.
And making sure that they have the same opportunities as everyone else.
It's about empowerment.
It is.
And agency. And creating a world where everybody has the chance to achieve their full potential.
Exactly.
Regardless of ability or disability.
And that's a vision worth fighting for.
It is. So welcome back to the Deep Dive. we spent the last 2 parts really unpacking this complex issue of subminimum wage for disabled workers.
Yeah.
Digging into the history, the arguments, the policies. It's a lot to process.
It is, and your research has been so thorough, highlighting all the different nuances and perspectives.
Yeah. I think one of the things that really stuck with me is that idea of a perverse incentive that we talked about.
Yeah.
Like 14C was supposed to help.
Right.
But it kind of ended up trapping people in this cycle of poverty.
Yeah. It's a classic example of good intentions gone wrong.
Right.
And I think it speaks to the need to constantly evaluate and adapt social policies.
Yeah.
What might have seemed like a good idea back in 1938
right.
clearly has had some, unintended and pretty harmful consequences.
Right. We can't just set these things in motion and forget about them.
Exactly.
We have to assess the impact and be willing to make changes, especially when people's livelihoods and dignity are at stake.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so encouraging about this movement.
Yeah.
We're seeing a real shift in thinking with more and more people recognizing that subminimum wage is not only unjust, but also counterproductive.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what is like the one key takeaway that you want our listener to walk away with?
If I had to boil it down to one thing, it would be this: ending subminimum wage is not about charity. It's about justice. It's about recognizing the inherent worth and potential of every single person, regardless of disability, and making sure they have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
It's not about, doing someone a favor.
Right.
It's about righting a wrong and creating a society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
And I think it's important to connect this back to that broader conversation about disability rights and inclusion.
Right.
This isn't just an isolated issue. This is part of a much larger fight for equity and justice that touches everything.
Yeah.
From education and healthcare to housing and transportation.
We can't just talk about subminimum wage in a vacuum.
No.
Right? It has to be part of a more comprehensive approach.
It does.
To really dismantle those systemic barriers that have kept people with disabilities marginalized for so long.
Yeah. And that brings us to the question of action.
Okay.
What can our listener and others who care about this issue actually do to make a difference?
Yeah. I'm ready to move beyond just talking about it.
Right. So first and foremost, stay informed.
Okay.
You've done a great job researching this and educating yourself.
Thank you.
Which is fantastic, but this is an ongoing issue.
Right.
So keep learning, keep reading, keep engaging with different perspectives.
Knowledge is power, right?
It is. The more we understand about the complexities of this, the better equipped we are to advocate for change.
Oh.
And once you feel informed, reach out to your elected officials. Let them know that you care about this. And urge them to support legislation like the TCIEA that we talked about.
So it's about making our voices heard.
Yes.
And holding our representatives accountable.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of, grassroots organizing and community involvement.
Yeah.
Support disability rights organizations. To attend rallies. Share information on social media. Every action, big or small, contributes to the movement.
Yeah. It's about building a collective voice that's too loud to be ignored.
Exactly. And on a personal level, challenge those outdated attitudes and stereotypes whenever you see them. Whether it's in a conversation with friends or family.
Right.
Or witnessing something discriminatory happening in public, speak up.
I know that can be tough sometimes.
It can.
But it's so important.
It is. It's about creating this ripple effect of awareness and understanding.
And this isn't just about helping people with disabilities.
Right.
It's about standing with them.
It is.
And demanding justice and equality for all.
That's a great point. That's a powerful message to end on.
So for our listener, and for anyone listening who wants to dive even deeper into this issue, we have a fantastic resource to share.
We do.
You can visit Kairos Clan at www.kairosclan.com to learn more about their work and find ways to get involved.
They're doing incredible work on the ground.
Yeah.
Advocating for the rights of people with disabilities and pushing for that systemic change.
Yeah. And there's a specific call to action happening right now.
There is.
That's really relevant to our conversation.
Yes. They're encouraging people to submit comments on a proposed rule change related to Section 14C.
Okay.
And the deadline is January 17th.
Write that down.
So don't miss out on this opportunity to make your voice heard.
You can find a link to the comment portal in our show notes.
Every comment, every voice matters.
Yes.
So let's use this momentum to really push for a future where all workers, regardless of disability, are valued, respected, and compensated fairly.
That's a future worth fighting for.
It is.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into ending subminimum wage for disabled workers. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, this isn't the end of the conversation. Keep learning, keep engaging, and keep pushing for a more just and inclusive world.
Until next time, keep diving deeper.